conventional. I'm an Asian American immigrant myself, so I had to play that story. Go to school, I went to law school, worked on Wall Street, did all of that, and then decided this isn't for me. You know, there's something else that I want to do, and so I started exploring. In 2016, I left working at a big law firm in London, and it's been a pretty wild journey ever since then. So I found myself in this world that some of you guys might have heard of around cryptocurrency or blockchain. I first really got into the space through a sheer accident, how I got to IXO, meeting my founder. So some of you might have heard of Silk Road. So an example of how the space has evolved. Silk Road was one of the first use cases of the cryptocurrency called Bitcoin. It was an underground marketplace that sold anything that wasn't legal to sell. And it was kind of a protest to say, well, you know, we should have freedom of transactions as adults, even if society doesn't agree with those value choices. So that was the founder of Silk Road's philosophy. So there were a lot of, you know, it was a lot of drug trades on Silk Road using Bitcoin. And it's taken out by the feds, and the creator of Silk Road, Ross Ulbricht, was sentenced to life without possibility of parole. He was in a prison in downtown Manhattan at the Metropolitan Correctional Center for several years. And I had the privilege of getting to know him because he's quite a thoughtful person. And it was, you know, I wasn't sure if I completely agreed with all the ideology, but what's really amazing is that the space has really grown to include a range of different ideologies and thinkings. So you started off with really libertarian mindset, and now we have other thinking around how this technology can be used in ways that people can really relate to in a way that's quite positive. Right? So that's how I got to meet my founder, Sean, who's been working on digital identity. He's been a public health professional and a doctor in South Africa his entire career. And when he saw the technology around blockchain, he saw the potential to apply it towards transparency, actually, around how funds are spent. How do we account for and attribute positive externalities? And therefore, it allows us to measure those positive impacts, which then allows us to finance and fund them, right? So that was really the idea behind IXO. How do we create a blockchain protocol that allows us to capture information about good things people are doing? How do we quantify it? And then how do we create a digital asset that's based on these measurable positive impacts?
Right. And IXO Foundation can be found at ixo.foundation, right?
Yeah, ixo.network. There's ixo. Yeah. So all of it's there. We can probably push out some links.
Okay. So it's basically a tool to use the latest cutting-edge technology to measure impact. And quantify it, and especially now with the United Nations setting a very aggressive goal for social change by 2030, but there's no way to actually quantify some of the changes. Something like this can go on the ground all around the world and quantify the positive impact that people are doing. So I want to now discuss a little bit about what's happening in New York. We had a number of conversations about in the past few months about holding public dollars and public investments accountable. And we in New York actually spend so much money, roughly around, I think, $13 billion a year. In 2015 alone, the state of New York spent nearly $9 billion in corporate welfare. City of New York spent around $3 billion. This corporate welfare can be tax incentives, tax subsidies, tax breaks, a number of things to entice corporations to come into business, but we have no idea if they're actually doing anything positive or serving the public. And how would, in a situation like this, something like the IXO Foundation, IXO protocol, come in and hold those dollars and corporations accountable and measure what they do?
Right. So the way I like to think about all these tools is that they're technology-enabled governance mechanisms, right? Because that's the issue at hand. Is, well, there's this pot of funding that's supposed to be spent for these set of prerogatives. So now we're going to have to get very clear in defining what specific projects and within those projects what specific activities will be funded and who's going to sign off on the transfer of those funds. So what the technology does is make that automated and make it difficult for anyone to tamper with. Right. So it's an automatic enforcement mechanism for our governance around our public funding.
Right. So for every dollar that they say they're going to do something with, we can put certain safeguards, make sure that that's being delivered, and there's no intermediaries, there's no people that can release that money until something is delivered for public good. Is that kind of how we would be set up? Okay.
So you can design, I'll give you some concrete examples in the context in which ICSO is being piloted.
Sure.
So one example in the social impact space is around this concept called the social impact bond.
Sure.
So what that means is there's a certain project that we want to fund, and it's actually more like can be like a private-public partnership. So you have what's called an outcomes funder that could be a government agency, or it could be a large private foundation or donor that said, well, if you prove that certain predefined social outcomes are met, then we will pay back the cost of funding this program. And then on the other side of that, you have what's called an impact investor. Usually it's a private party that says, we will take the risk and we will take the working capital risk to fund this project, and we'll only get paid back if and only if those predefined outcome metrics are met. Right. So in the case we're working on with UBS Optimus Foundation, which is a foundation arm of UBS Bank, and so they've been very successful in piloting an initial development / social impact bond in India to fund girls' education programs. And so they want to scale that up, and so they're like, well, how do we scale this up? Because the monitoring and evaluation costs are so high, because now you have to really go into all these schools and make sure, are the services being delivered by the service providers, the lesson plans, and maybe to measure the learning outcomes of the girls. And if they want to scale that across all of India, then you need a technology to assist that, to make it possible to evaluate outcomes and progress on a granular level, right? Because otherwise, if everything is completely manual, it's very hard to scale the effects of that program. So we're piloting with UBS on their second girls' education program in India. So the idea being that if we provide these kind of technology-enabled tools, allowing even a simple phone, right, to collect data about the lesson plans being delivered, to collect other information, then we can track in real time what services are being delivered, are these learning metrics being met.
And I think one important thing about the blockchain technology, just to talk about the background of it, is that it's once the data is submitted, it's almost impossible for someone to come in and hack and tamper with that data. That's one of the positive traits of this decentralized technology, right? So once it's in there, it's part of a permanent ledger that gets transferred to point A to point B, mainly from peer-to-peer kind of transactions, right?
Right. So yes. So you would have to define, well, who gets to sign off on this piece of information, right? That this lesson plan was delivered, that these learning outcomes were measured, right? So again, there's a governance layer that gets encoded literally, right, into something called a smart contract, which is a computer code, and there are ways to show that this information hasn't been tampered with. And also, there's what's really cool in all these kind of cases is that what we are in fact doing is providing a digital identity to these to all the stakeholders, to the girls who are students who probably don't have any form of formal ID, but now they get to collect their own digital history and digital record that they've attended class, that these are their learning outcomes. And so I think that's going to be hugely powerful in itself to have that digital history, so that enables you to maybe get a loan or to apply for a job.
So going back to some of these corporate subsidies and welfare, we can also measure if there's negative impact, right? So if a corporation comes in and they're not adding value, and it's clear data showing that they're extracting value and money out of local economies, we can also institute some sort of fines, not only rewards,
but also
fines and penalties and fees for not contributing, not delivering what they're supposed to deliver, right? So that's the next part I wanted to talk to you about. And just philosophically, we don't have the data, we don't have the impact yet to verify whether they have a positive or negative impact, and hopefully we'll have that soon. And actually, a few years ago, in 2016, the New York City Council had a tax expenditure task force that came out and said, we actually have no idea if we have any impact on some of these tax breaks that we're giving to corporations. Billions of dollars every single year that's giving to corporations. I read some numbers on the second was highest category of debt in our country, which is student debt. In New York City, New York State, we have about $83 billion of student debt right now, of which 15% of people is considered troubled debt and distressed debt, and that's roughly around $12–15 billion of debt that's in distress in the state of New York. Around about the same amount of money that we're giving away to corporations, $12–15 million a year. So if you had to just, with your expertise of measuring impact for the last couple of years, do you think we would have a more positive impact for our economy and our future in New York City and New York State if we were able to help those people in distress, in debt, versus giving that $12–15 billion to corporations?
I absolutely think that student debt is the one form of debt that doesn't get written off in bankruptcy. It follows you literally to the grave, right? So, and that's a real burden on young folks. So if we're going to go, if we're going to go and say, oh, we need these corporations to come into the state, so we're going to give them this care of a tax break. Well, that should come with an obligation, right? Because otherwise, we haven't achieved the goal of that tax break. So could you attach the tax break, and you only give the tax break, right, if it's linked to provable, measurable targets, right? So have you hired X number of locals, right? Have you done, what's your employment record? And are they being paid fair wages, right? So all of that. And then you get your tax breaks. Or some, if you're a nonprofit in the United States, you are required by law, by the tax, because why you're getting tax breaks as a nonprofit, if you're not spending the money that you're raising on those actual programs and services, right? So nonprofits and foundations in the U.S. are obligated by law to spend 5% of their endowment on services every year to other charities. So why don't we have the same requirements at the minimum for the corporate tax breaks that we're giving to for-profits?
And actually recent studies have came out and said that New York ranks last in returns on billions of dollars for corporate giveaways. We are the most expensive economic development funding. 76% of the state gross tax revenue goes to corporate giveaways in the state of New York. So already we have some preliminary data that says this is ineffective, but yet we have executive leaders who are going into Amazon, who are traveling to Seattle, promising them hundreds of millions of dollars of corporate welfare for them to come here, the city of New York, Long Island City, to open up shop. So why do you think we have a neoliberal, kind of corporate politicians who keep doubling down on traditional way of thinking that this is the only way we can grow our economy?
Oh, well, I think that the answer is simple. It sounds like, to me, classic corruption.
Okay.
You know?
Okay. Well,
I mean, you know, but that's where the incentives are, is that if there's no accountability, right, then, you know, what are those kickbacks, right? So
right. So
support my campaign of this and that, my pet projects, right?
So the concentrated powers, whether it's government or whether it's private sector, there's corruption that follows any space that's have too much concentrated power and wealth.
Exactly.
And a blockchain, a decentralized protocol, something like the IXO Foundation can come in and hold every dollar, every funding, every public taxpayer's dollar accountable to make sure that there's verifiable data that's proving that that's delivering on the promise that we've actually signed up for. So so really rooting out the ability for anyone to come in and extract or be corrupt and exchange these dollars for personal favors. Is that
yes, to make it certainly more expensive for people, right? So I do want to caveat and say, well, technology only works within the context of humans, right?
Sure.
So it will not be always 100% absolute, but can we use technology in a way that makes it more expensive, more difficult for someone to try to cheat the system?
Right. Okay. Well, that's good enough. Well, how much do you think something like this would cost for a nonprofit like IXO Foundation to set up a protocol system to keep $15 billion of taxpayers' money accountable? Like, how much would it cost the state to institute such a program?
That's hard to say off the top of my head, because it depends on the scope and the context by which you want to define your parameters. But the goal would be so in the development space, if you spend easily, 5 to 10% of a program cost on evaluation and monitoring. So what we're doing now is saying, well, let's take that 5 to 10% and let's reduce that drastically as much as we can, right? Okay. So that's part of the work that we're doing now in running this protocol and seeing how much we can reduce those monitoring evaluation costs. In the case of public sector, there is no budget at all, it seems, for monitoring evaluation, right? So the cost saving would be, well, how much more, it's a different equation, because now it's, of that $15 billion of tax cuts, we're actually we want to make sure all $15 billion of that tax cut returns at least $15 billion or more of social gains, right, to society, right? So it's a little bit of a different kind of evaluation, but I think it's important that we, from a governance standpoint, start by thinking, okay, how do we create the controls and governance mechanisms? But the other thing about the blockchain technology tools is that it makes it a lot cheaper to crowdfund, right? So it's not just, I've got the money, how do I disperse it? But it's, how do I get money and then prove in a cost-effective way to all these small contributors what the impacts are. And if I'm going to pay the small contributors a small return on their social investment, I've dramatically reduced the cost of that accounting mechanism using this technology tool.
Right. So in the front end, people often, the political leaders will say, well, they're producing 10,000, 20,000, 50,000 jobs, and all these people are going to be moving in. But the way that the system is currently designed, they're actually incentivized. Companies like Amazon are incentivized, and they're actually given more tax breaks to replace people with machines, because they can write it off as capital cost. So even our tax system in the back end is flawed. So they may come in and say, oh, we create $20,000. Guess what? They're going to start replacing every one of those people with machines come next year, 5 years from now. Because that's how they're going to make their profits. That's where the profit margins will come in for them. So there has to be a redesign on the front and the back end, our tax codes, toward keeping corporations more accountable.
Right.
And we can't just rely on the front end jobs, because for every one job, in my opinion, that they create, they're actually ruining all these other jobs in our local economies, and small businesses will be shut down as a result of their extractive practices, probably ruining for every one job hundreds or more jobs in our local communities. So I think that's something that we can definitely use some data verification protocols to see what is the real impact of corporate giveaways. I look forward to working with you on some of this. I know we'll be talking about some legislation, so let's get that done next couple of weeks, and we'll keep working together. Thank you so much for your time, Fanny.
You too, Ron. This is